In our continuing series on basic Photoshop tools, I'm going to introduce you to some blending modes that you can work with when you're building multi-layered composite images using layers. And we're going to also talk about applying transforms to layers to help them blend into a scene overall. As well as, blending modes can be actually used to adjust photographs. So let's take a look at some of the ways that layers can be used to build multi-layered composite images. For example, if we take a look at this example here, this might be the beginnings of a background for perhaps a web page. As you can see, there's the beginnings of some navigation items, site search is included. And if we look at our layers panel, you can see that this very beginnings of a design for a website or just a web page is built with just a ton of different layers. And you can see as I turn layers on and off that different elements can be shown and hidden. And each element on its own isn't really much to look at, but it's sort of the combination of the elements that builds multi-layered composite documents and can be used for a variety of graphic designs in this way. This basic design was used with blending modes, and your blending modes are found here in the Layers panel. So let's take a look at what some of these blending modes can offer and just introduce you to the concept of blending modes. So for example, if we start with nothing here, you can see that the background layer is just black. And then we start to add a little bit of color, and we start to add a photo here, which is this sunburst, using the screen blending mode. Then the next layer uses the lighten blending mode, which allows only the lightest elements to show, and it kind of dumps the green. Notice if we had that one in normal mode at 100% opacity, you'd see this green background here. But by changing opacities and blending modes, you're able to create more complex design. And on their own, once again, not very interesting. But then as we change the blending mode, we start to build multi-layered, very textural, complex elements. And then by using this little gradient layer here, it kind of blends it all together and creates one cohesive piece. If we look at some of the different blending modes individually, it's kind of hard to explain in words what these blending modes do. And it's a really interesting and powerful tool available to you in Photoshop with layers, but so much can be learned through experimentation. And you will have an opportunity to experiment on your own. But I can just introduce you to some of these blending modes right now. So say, for example, we start with this word layers. And it's written in green, and it's here in normal blending mode, which means this is its normal state at 100% opacity. Of course, I can change that opacity, and you can see how that adjusts the layer there. But normal mode means this is the root, this is the actual element in its native state. Now if I turn this off and look at a different blending mode, you can see that I'm using the blending mode of vivid light and how that changes. This is actually a copy of the original word layers, and you can see how that changes what's going on, the way that it blends with the background. Take a look at soft light. It's going to do a little bit mellower version of the vivid light, which really brings out the brightness characteristics of that color in the word layers. If I add using multiply, okay, so it's going to multiply, it's like using a transparency of that green word layers on top of the others. Overlay, very similar to using a transparency, but it picks up more of the brightness or the value, or I would say maybe the characteristics or brightness of that word layers. Using the dodge blending mode, dodge lighten things. Dodge is a photography word that is typical, used in meaning to lighten. So that's why that in that case it would be much lighter, versus burn. And you can recall from using the burn tool in the basic tools demo. Burn is going to darken elements behind it, but again, it still acts as sort of a transparency layer that we're adding. Using the luminosity blending, it actually seems to pick up the luminous qualities of the layer colors below. Difference is a blending mode that actually takes the difference between the tone and hue of the layers word, which we had in a light green, versus the background, which in this case is kind of purples and blues. Exclusion gives you a much different effect. Hue is just going to do a transparency of the green of the word layers. And the next two layers are going to show you how blending modes can actually be used to throw out background elements. For example, if I look at this layer here, let me move this over so you can see. If I look at this layer here in its normal state, I'll return it to normal. You can see that this is a stock image and it has a very light background. But if we wanted to sort of blend this item into the background elements and throw out the light background, we can use a darken blending mode, and it's going to throw out that light background. Similarly, if we have an element that had a very dark background, we'll look at it in normal mode. You can see that it had a black background. If we then apply the lighten filter to it, it throws out the dark background. So in this way, you can build multi-layered composite images, and you can blend them together and get a lot of interesting and unique effects. But it does take quite a bit of experimentation and time to sort of get a feel for what each of these blending modes does. So let's take a look at another way that blending modes can be used to create image correction. So if I look at this image in its base state, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that you can see it better. But this image here in its basic state is a little bit dark. And so I could go into image and adjustments and play with the levels and brightness and contrast. But sometimes that can add to the graininess in a photo. And if you don't want to lose image quality, and sometimes to combat the graininess, you can actually use layers to create image adjustments. So here's the photo using the levels adjustment. And one of the things about the levels adjustment that I didn't like is that it threw out the color. It really seemed to ignore the color in the sky in this image. It did lighten elements in the background to kind of bring out the saturation of the colors of the trees, but it didn't do much justice to the sky. In another case, I used the screen blending mode in order to lighten the image. So the screen blending mode can sometimes be used in lieu of using image and adjustments. You can also try using the lighten blending mode, but it kind of throws out everything that's dark and that's not really giving us what we want. And I think in this case, the screen blending mode really gives us a much better overall range of tonal quality and hues. So that's a way that layer blending modes can be used to actually make image adjustments or photo corrections. In other cases, when you're making multi-layered composite images, it is possible to make some transformations to individual layers so that everything looks like it fits together. So for example, this is like a visa area for stamping in a passport, a typical United States passport. And if we look at the layers here, I'll just bring these over here, I want to add these passport stamps. I want to add the passport stamps, but there's a couple of problems. One is there's a light background to these passport stamps. They're not at the right angle, and they're not at the right perspective. So the first thing that I can do is I can use a blending mode to throw out that white background. So if I use darken mode, you can see how it immediately throws out the light background, and it's the same passport stamps, but what remains are the stamps themselves. So that's helpful, but it still doesn't really look like it's fitting into this stamping area of the passport. So I can actually use transform tools for individual layers. So I'll turn this layer on, and if I go under Edit and Transform, you can see the following possibilities could be used: scale, rotate, skew, distort, perspective, and warp. All could be used in concert or in various different ways to bring these stamps into perspective. So I could do this in a couple of different ways. One way would be Edit, Transform, and Skew. And I can kind of skew these elements here, kind of playing with the perspective. Hit return. I can go Edit, Transform, Rotate. I can rotate the stamps. And another thing that's good to know about the Transform tool is if you want to bring the Transform tool up, I can go Command-T on a Mac or Control-T on any other system, and it brings up this bounding box. And that's your Transform tool. You can see as I hover over the corners of the box, I get the ability to rotate because my cursor changes to those little rotation symbol. I can scale it, which I don't really want to do because that's going to blow this thing out of proportion. But that's the quick key for bringing up the Transform tool. I could also go Edit, Transform, and Perspective, and I can kind of squeeze this item and add a little bit of perspective so that it seems a little more realistic, because as this passport recedes into the background, things get further away and look smaller. So once I'm fairly happy with the transforms that I made, I hit the return, and I can kind of move, try this in different places and move those stamps onto the passport. And the other thing that's bothering me a bit is it just seems like these stamps are way too bright. They don't look very realistic because they're just a little bit bright. So again, I can go into my Layers panel and I can change the opacity of that layer so that it just seems like it's fitting in a little more realistic into the poster. So that's a demonstration of how layers can be used in conjunction with the Transform tool to make multi-layered composite images work together as a cohesive unit. And this concludes the introduction of working with layers and blending modes in your Adobe Photoshop arsenal of tools.